I'm Linda Parker, 62 years old, a mother, a retired hospital administrator, and someone who once believed love always came full circle. For most of my life, that belief kept me steady through single parenthood, double shifts, and every bill that needed paying. But I learned that even the deepest love can lose its way when tested by money and pride. It still feels strange to say it out loud, but my son once told me that $85,000 was too much to save my life. A few weeks later, he spent $230,000 celebrating his wife's birthday. Those numbers have lived in my head ever since, not because of the money itself, but because of what it revealed about who we both were. When I think back, I can still see the look on his face the last time I walked into his office before everything changed. He looked busy, important, the way any proud mother wants her child to look. I didn't know that moment would become the line dividing my old life from the new one. People sometimes ask me why I share this story. Maybe it's because somewhere out there, another parent is sitting alone, wondering how love and gratitude could disappear so easily. Or maybe it's because telling it helps me remember that survival isn't just about living, it's about choosing to keep faith in yourself when others won't. I'm not here to paint villains or victims. This isn't revenge. It's a story about seeing clearly for the first time, about realizing that sometimes the people you would give your life for wouldn't spend $1 to keep you here. And that realization began on an ordinary afternoon, in a small examination room, when a doctor's words turned my world upside down. It was around 2:10 in the afternoon when I sat in Dr. Patel's office, clutching a stack of medical papers that felt heavier than any weight I had ever carried. The lights above me buzzed softly. Too bright. Too white. Almost cruel in how clearly they illuminated everything I didn't want to see. Cancer. Aggressive. 3 months without immediate treatment. The words echoed in my head like footsteps in an empty hallway. I remember nodding, pretending to be composed, while a quiet panic started pressing against my ribs. I thought of my garden, the one I'd tended for 15 years, and how I might never see another spring bloom there. The treatment plan sounded like a miracle wrapped in numbers. A specialized therapy, not covered by insurance, but with a real chance of survival. It cost $85,000. $85,000, my best shot at life. As I left the clinic, the late afternoon light felt unfamiliar, as if the world had kept spinning while I stood still. I drove straight to my son Ryan's law office downtown. I didn't plan it. My hands just turned the wheel on their own. He was my only child, the one I had raised alone after his father left when Ryan was 12. I had spent decades working night shifts, missing birthdays, saving for his future. I told myself that if there was ever a time I could lean on him, it was now. Walking into that glass building felt like walking into another world. Marble floors, the faint scent of expensive cologne, his name engraved on a bronze plaque by the elevator. Pride and fear mixed in my chest like oil and water. When I saw him behind that massive desk, head bent over case files, I felt both comfort and distance. My son had made it. He looked successful, secure, everything I had ever hoped for him. And for a brief second, I thought that meant I was safe too. But deep down, even before I opened my mouth, a quiet voice whispered that things were about to change. And I was right. Because that was the afternoon I asked my son for help, and the moment I learned how fragile love can become when measured in dollars. When I sat across from Ryan in his office that day, my heart was doing two things at once. It was begging and breaking. I told him about the diagnosis, about how the doctor said I had maybe 3 months without treatment, maybe longer if I started right away. I explained what the therapy cost, 85,000美元, and how it wasn't covered by insurance. I thought if I spoke calmly, if I reminded him that I wasn't asking for a favor, but for time, he would understand. For a moment, I believed he did. He looked shocked, maybe even hurt. And I saw the boy I once tucked into bed after thunderstorms, I remember thinking that love would carry us through, that the bond between mother and son was stronger than any number on a medical bill. But then, something shifted in his voice. It became measured. Professional like I was a client in his office instead of his mother. He said things that sounded reasonable on the surface about responsibilities. The economy. Starting a family with Savannah. He mentioned their emergency fund. How they needed to be cautious. But underneath those words was a quiet refusal. I could feel it. I could hear Savannah's influence in the spaces between his sentences. That night, around 7:40 in the evening, I sat in my kitchen staring at the same papers I had shown him. The clock ticked loudly, like it was keeping time on my hope. I thought about every double shift I'd worked when he was in law school. Every Christmas morning I spent wrapping gifts after working the night before. Every moment I believed we were a team. And then the realization hit me like a wave I didn't see coming. I had raised a man who could find logic in letting his mother die. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just reasoned his way out of love. I remember whispering to myself that night, this can't be the end of my story. Not like this. I didn't know how. But something inside me decided that if I had to fight for my life, I would do it with or without him. And 3 days later, the universe gave me the cruelest confirmation of what I already knew. 3 days later, the confirmation I feared arrived not in words, but in silence. Ryan didn't come by. He called instead, his tone practiced and careful, as if he'd spent time rehearsing how to sound sympathetic without making promises. He said he and Savannah had talked it over, that they needed to be realistic, that $85,000 was their entire emergency fund. He said they had plans for the future, possible medical needs of their own. I listened, but what I really heard was distance, an invisible wall between us. Every sentence felt like a polite way of saying, you're on your own. I remember staring out the kitchen window while he spoke, watching the last of the summer light fade over my garden. It was the same garden I used to plant with him when he was little. Back then, he'd dig holes too deep for tomato seedlings, and laugh when I pretended to scold him. That memory hurt more than the words. Because now, that same boy, the one I'd once held through fevers and heartbreak, was explaining to me that survival came second to financial planning. After the call ended, I sat at the table in complete stillness. My coffee had gone cold. The house was too quiet. It felt like something inside me had been unplugged. The realization that your child sees your life as negotiable is a kind of grief you can't really describe. It doesn't explode, it just settles. Heavy and permanent. I tried to remind myself that he had always been practical, that maybe fear was guiding him. But even that small comfort couldn't soften what I knew to be true love, that requires justification isn't love at all. That night, I told myself I would find another way. I would not let his refusal be the reason I stopped fighting. I didn't know it yet, but the world was about to show me just how deep his choices went and what they truly cost. A few days after that call, I opened my laptop to distract myself and saw a post that made my stomach turn. It was Savannah's birthday invitation, an extravagant digital card decorated with gold accents and white roses. The caption said, "A night to remember at the Four Seasons Ballroom." At first, I thought maybe it was a small dinner. Something elegant but modest. Then I kept scrolling. Black tie dress code. A 5-course meal from the city's most exclusive caterer. A live band from Nashville. Photos of custom floral arrangements. Ice sculptures. A designer gown. Luxury everything. I didn't want to, but I did the math. The flowers alone had to cost around $15,000. Catering close to $30,000. The band another $25,000. Her gown $8,000, and that was before venue fees. Decorations. And staff. By the time I was done adding it up, the total sat around $230,000. For one night, I stared at those numbers until they blurred on the screen. My hands actually shook. I remember thinking, How strange. That the same son who couldn't find $85,000 to save my life could so easily spend nearly 3 times that amount on a party. Scrolling through the comments made it worse, people praising Savannah's taste, saying she deserved it, calling her radiant. Ryan was in some of the photos. Tuxedo perfectly tailored. Smile polished for the camera. In one picture, he held a champagne glass, giving a toast. The caption under it read that his speech brought the room to tears. The words echoed in my mind. Nothing was too good for the woman he loved. I sat there in the quiet, realizing what that meant for me. What it meant for every year I'd spent working, saving, sacrificing so he could have the life he wanted. It wasn't about the money, it was about value, about worth. That night, I stopped crying. Something inside me hardened just enough to keep me standing. I decided that if my son could live in a world where a party was worth more than a life, then I would start living in a world where my life belonged to me. And that's exactly what I did next. The morning after I saw those party photos, I woke up with a calmness that didn't make sense. It wasn't peace, it was resolve. Around 9:05 that morning, I sat in a bank office with a woman named Mrs. Chen, signing away the home I'd built my entire adult life around. The pen felt heavy in my hand, but the sound it made when it clicked was sharp, final, like the start of something new. Mrs. Chen looked at me with quiet concern. She suggested safer options. Reverse mortgages. Slower processes. But I told her I needed the money right away. I think she saw it in my eyes that this wasn't desperation. It was survival. By the time I walked out with a certified check for $92,000, my hands were steady for the first time in weeks. Driving home, I caught myself exhaling a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding since the diagnosis. The world outside looked the same traffic lights, same sidewalks, but something inside me had shifted completely. I wasn't waiting for anyone to save me anymore. I was my own safety net. At 2:30 that afternoon, I went to the oncology center. The financial counselor accepted the payment, and for a moment, the weight of uncertainty lifted. The next available treatment slot was Monday at 8 in the morning. I wrote it down on the small notepad I kept by my bed and circled the date. Then I wrote one single word beside it: fight. That night, I sat in my quiet living room and let the reality sink in. I was risking everything: my home, my stability, my future for a chance to live. But as strange as it sounds, it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a promise to myself, to the woman who had once believed she wasn't worth saving. And when that Monday came, I kept my promise. The first treatment started that Monday morning at 8 o'clock sharp. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and hope. If those two things can exist together, I remember the nurse's kind eyes, the steady rhythm of the IV pump, and the soft hum of the machine that would decide whether I got to keep living. Each session blurred into the next long hours under fluorescent lights. The slow drip of chemicals meant to kill what was killing me. Every drop had a price tag attached to it, thousands of dollars disappearing with each passing minute. But I refused to think of it as money leaving me. I thought of it as time coming back. There were days when I couldn't eat, days when my skin felt too heavy, when I could barely walk from my bed to the couch. I learned to measure progress differently, not by strength, but by will. If I could wake up, make tea at 6:10 in the morning, and look out my kitchen window at the fading blooms in my garden, that was victory enough. I would whisper to myself that I'd see another season, that maybe, just maybe, I'd live long enough to feel the sun again without the shadow of fear behind it. Months passed that way. The treatments were brutal, but I endured them because every ache reminded me I was still fighting. The nurses began to smile when I walked in, saying I looked stronger. And deep down, I could feel it too, my body responding, my mind steadying. Then came the day Dr. Tace quote. Patel looked at my scans with something soft in her eyes. The word remission slipped into the air. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something other than pain. I felt freedom. I drove home that afternoon in silence, gripping the steering wheel as if I might float away. The city looked different, brighter, fuller, alive. And I realized that surviving wasn't just about beating cancer. It was about shedding every illusion that had kept me small. But survival was only the beginning. What came next was rebuilding and disappearing. When Dr. Patel told me I was officially in remission, I smiled. But what I really felt was exhaustion, the kind that sinks into your bones after months of fighting for every breath. That same afternoon, I drove home and sat in my driveway for a long time, staring at the front door of the house I had worked my entire life to protect. It no longer felt like home. It felt like a reminder of everything I had traded to stay alive. The mortgage I had taken for my treatment meant the house was barely mine anymore. Still, I sold it. I needed more than walls. I needed a fresh start. When the papers were signed, I didn't look back. I packed my car with only what I needed: some clothes, my garden gloves, a few old photos, and the teacup I used every morning during chemo. I chose Scottsdale, Arizona. The air there was warm and dry, easier on my recovering body, and far enough 1,500 miles from the life I wanted to leave behind. I rented a small apartment in a quiet retirement community where no one knew my story. I changed my phone number, deleted my social media, and left no forwarding address. To the world, I disappeared. It was terrifying and liberating all at once. I no longer owed explanations. I could wake up when I wanted, breathe without fear, and finally rest without waiting for a phone that never rang. Slowly, I began to rebuild a rhythm. I met people who carried their own kinds of loneliness. Margaret, a retired teacher who missed her husband. Frank, a quiet accountant who was learning to smile again after divorce. And Sarah, whose children lived in Europe and rarely called. We were a little family of the forgotten, bound by second chances. We'd share coffee on the patio in the mornings, laughing about small things, planting bits of ourselves back into the world. In that silence between laughter, I found peace again, not the peace of safety, but the peace of survival. And as that peace began to settle in, a new question started forming quietly in my mind. What if I could build more than just a life here? What if I could build a future? Frank was the one who gave me my first small step back into the world. One morning over coffee, he mentioned that he needed help with bookkeeping for his little investment side business. It wasn't much, he said, just a few clients, mostly retirees trying to stretch their savings. I had always been good with numbers, so I agreed. It gave me something to do, something that made me feel useful again. That's how it started. A few spreadsheets, a few late nights, and a quiet reminder that I still had a brain that worked. Before long, other residents began asking for help too. People wanted advice about their pensions, their 401ks, their small investments. I didn't have fancy degrees in finance, but I had patience and common sense. I explained things simply, no jargon, no pressure. I told them what I had learned the hard way: never let anyone else decide your worth. Not even with money. Within months, my calendar filled up. Frank introduced me to a few of his contacts downtown, and word spread faster than I expected. I began taking small risks, measured ones. Renewable energy, clean tech, steady companies with strong ethics. I didn't gamble, I planned. And somehow, planning turned into growth. By the end of my first year, I was earning more than I ever had working full-time back in Seattle. By year 2, I had my own small consulting office. I still drove my old car, still packed my lunch, still tended to my new desert garden every morning at 7:15. But inside, I was changing. I was no longer just surviving, I was thriving. My portfolio grew faster than I could track. Clients trusted me. My name started to carry weight in local business circles. By year 3, I owned a modest home again, nothing extravagant, but warm and peaceful. I remember planting herbs in the backyard one evening around 5:30 and realizing I was genuinely happy. I had built a life that no one could take from me. A life funded by courage instead of approval. And I thought that was the end of my story, the quiet, content kind of ending that people like me rarely get. But fate wasn't done yet. Because one article, one photograph, would make me visible again to the very person I had tried to disappear from. One morning, about 3 years after I'd moved to Scottsdale, my assistant Angela walked into my office holding a local business magazine. The cover stopped me cold. It was my face, me, standing in front of my downtown office, smiling, arms crossed. The headline read, "The Investor Who Speaks Human." The article talked about my small firm, how I'd built it from nothing, how I was helping retirees take control of their money. It was meant to be inspiring, and in many ways, it was. But as I looked at that photo, I felt a small ripple of unease. Success makes you visible again. Visibility attracts everything, including the things you thought you'd left behind. Still, I let myself enjoy the moment. I'd worked for this. I'd earned every word printed on that page. For a while, I thought maybe my past was far enough behind me to stay there. That illusion lasted exactly 1 week. It was 11:40 in the morning when Angela buzzed my office. Her voice carried a mix of confusion and hesitation. She said there was a man in the lobby asking to see me, no appointment. Just insistence. She told me he said his name was Ryan. I felt my heart still for a second. 6 years of silence. And suddenly his name was back in the air like an old song you never wanted to hear again. I remember asking her calmly if he looked desperate. She paused, then said yes. That one word told me everything I needed to know. I closed the magazine, straightened my papers, and told her to send him in. Because after all those years of quiet, the story that began with his refusal was about to circle back, and this time, I would be the one holding the choice. When Ryan walked into my office that morning, I barely recognized him. The confident, sharply dressed attorney I remembered had been replaced by a man who looked hollowed out. His suit was wrinkled, his hair unkempt, his shoulders bent beneath some invisible weight. It wasn't the cancer in my body this time, it was in his life. He stood there for a long moment, eyes wide, like he couldn't believe I was real. I could almost hear what he was thinking, that I had died. Quietly and conveniently. Just as he'd once predicted. I didn't offer him a seat. I waited. Finally, he began to speak. The story spilled out of him in pieces, how Savannah had convinced him to move everything into her name for tax purposes. How she'd slowly taken control of his firm's accounts. How she'd drained them all before vanishing with a man she'd been seeing for years. A personal trainer named Brad. Everything was gone. The house, the cars, the practice, the savings, even his reputation. He told me he was facing bankruptcy. Possible fraud charges. That he might lose his license to practice law. The number that sealed his ruin was staggering: $2 million lost to a woman who had planned every step of his downfall. I sat there, calm, listening. I didn't interrupt. I didn't reach for him. I just let him talk. Because what could I possibly say? The same woman he had once spent $230,000 on for a single night had taken everything from him. In a strange, painful way. It felt like the universe had returned balance to a scale I hadn't even known existed. I should have felt triumphant. I didn't. I just felt awed. Tired. What he didn't know, though, was that I already had a folder on my desk, a file with Brad's name on it. My firm had done some quiet research on him after a client mentioned his name in passing. Brad was back in the States, living here in Phoenix. And as fate would have it, he knew more about Savannah's schemes than Ryan could ever imagine. For the first time in years, I realized I had power in this story. Real power. And I was about to decide what to do with it. I remember sitting there, watching Ryan fall apart in front of me, and feeling the strangest mix of emotions. Pity, anger, sadness, they all tangled together until I couldn't tell one from the other. For years, I had imagined what I would say if this day ever came, but now that it was here, I didn't feel satisfaction. I just felt the heavy weight of what life had taught us both. On my desk was the folder, the one with Brad's name on it. Inside were statements, emails, records, even a note from a federal prosecutor who wanted Brad's testimony about Savannah's financial crimes. Brad was willing to cooperate in exchange for immunity. I had everything Ryan needed to clear his name and start over. And I had a choice. I told him, quietly and steadily, that I could fix this, that I could call the right people and make the legal storm go away. But before I did, I wanted him to understand something, what it truly feels like to beg for your life. I wanted him to feel what I'd felt 6 years earlier. Sitting in my kitchen, praying for mercy that never came. He understood immediately. I saw it in his face, the shame, the realization, the breaking of pride. Slowly, he knelt beside my desk, his voice trembling, asking me to help him, to save him the way he couldn't save me. I thought I'd feel victorious in that moment, but I didn't. There was no triumph in seeing your child humbled, just sadness that it had taken so much pain for him to finally see me. I helped him anyway. I gave him the $50,000 he needed for legal defense, along with the file that would clear his name. I told myself that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting it, just meant choosing peace over poison. And as he left my office that day, I realized I hadn't given him money or mercy. I had given him a mirror. The reflection would change him forever. Months later, the news came quietly. Ryan's charges were dismissed. Brad's testimony exposed everything Savannah had done: the forged documents, the fake accounts, the trail of stolen investments that had ruined multiple lives. Ryan's name was cleared. His law license was reinstated. He started a small firm again, this time helping seniors who had been defrauded or manipulated, people just like me years ago. Every Sunday, without fail, he called. The first few times, we barely spoke beyond small talk. But slowly, the walls between us began to crack. He didn't ask for money or forgiveness. He just asked how I was doing. About 6 months later, he flew to Arizona. When he walked into my office again, he looked stronger, older, but steadier. In his hand was a cashier's check for $85,000. The same amount that had once stood between my life and death. He told me he wanted to repay the debt. Not because I needed it, but because he did. It was his way of closing the circle. I didn't take it. I told him I didn't need the money anymore. What I needed back then was love, compassion, and courage. And those are things you can't put a price on. But I let him leave the check on my desk, because I understood that for him, this wasn't repayment. It was redemption. When I look back now, I realize that forgiveness isn't weakness, it's freedom. I didn't forgive him to erase what happened. I forgave him because I refused to live chained to the moment he failed me. Some lessons cost everything to learn. He learned that love without sacrifice is hollow. I learned that strength without compassion turns to stone. If my story found you at the right time, take this with you: never let someone else decide your worth. And never confuse forgiveness with surrender. Sometimes walking away is power. Sometimes coming back is. If you understand that balance between mercy and self-respect, then maybe you've already learned what took me a lifetime to see. And if my journey meant something to you, take a moment to share it. Or tell me where you're listening from. You never know who might need to hear that second chances don't always start with someone else, they start with you.